Hey guys, Dave from Nerdarchy here, for Nerds by Nerds, with some of my esteemed colleagues.
I'm Ted.
Ryan.
Nate.
And today we're going to do a generic RPG discussion about genres. And today we're talking about RPGs and the fantasy genre. So guys, this is one we're pretty familiar with.
So,
you think?
It's the concept of the videos is to do like kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. You know, what's really good about gaming in fantasy and what's really bad. So let's start off with the good stuff.
I got one right off the bat. Here's like the biggest one for fantasy RPGs. It's the most popular. You're going to have the least amount of trouble finding a fantasy game and the least amount of resistance in starting one.
Yeah, like, because, you know, out of people that, like, play systems and don't play anything else, the most common is going to be, like, Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder.
Right, and that's the reason why, like, that core of, you know, tabletop role-playing has been so popular.
Straight up ubiquity.
That's apparently what the masses go for. So
nerds.
Well, you know, fantasy and sci-fi are the biggest. They're like, it's the biggest genre for reading and books out there, probably. So it only stands to reason that, you know, people who game tabletop tend to be a little more cerebral anyway,
right? And
they're going to be more readers, so that's what they're going to draw from, what they've read.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we don't have too many football players and lacrosse players at our tables.
Although with the whole geek thing catching on, like, eventually it might be like how, you know, like
pocket protectors and shoulder pads.
Yeah, that's right.
I played football in high school.
Yeah, it's true, but you're.
But that's because the coach wrangled you. He's like, "Oh, this kid is really big." And then they
big.
realize he's soft and fluffy.
Yeah.
He's not mean at all.
He's poking you with sticks.
He's trying to feed him gunpowder and steak.
Like doing a Clockwork Orange thing, holding his eyes open, making him watch like violent movies.
You will watch these forums.
Mushroom clouds. Yeah.
All right, so I would say, you know, kind of the next thing is, you know, since it's fantasy, the fantastic. You know, you have access to magic. You have access to creatures that are, you know, far beyond what exists in today's society.
There's dungeons people make for unknown purposes.
That's right.
In random places.
You could trip over a dungeon.
And there may be dragons in there.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
So variety.
So yes, variety.
Compared to, like, if you're playing a modern, like a top secret or ninjas and super spies type game.
If you're playing in a modern, you are human.
You're human, and you're probably not going to fight any ogres.
Right. You get to have some fantastical races and stuff like that. So that's cool to get to play something. You know, it's usually, you know, if you get into real world cultures and like. You know, you could get into like either, you know, like bad stereotyping or whatever.
Oh yeah.
You know, like, so that's part of it. So having the fantasy aspect gets a little further removed from that. Well,
also too, the lines are drawn much more clearly of, you know, for the good guys and the bad guys, the heroic and the villainous. I feel like. Right. You know, like the dragon is clearly the bad guy.
Yeah.
You like you absolutely know who to run through with a sword.
Right.
And it just feels more heroic to do it with a sword than like a gun.
Yeah, it's a lot more black and white. So there's that going on. Although there needs to be a little bit of side discussion because it's the level of fantasy in your game, like low fantasy to high fantasy. Yeah. So high fantasy, you can absolutely replicate anything in the modern world, just give it like arcane means.
Well, yeah, like in Eberron from 3rd edition D&D, which is almost like, you know, it's like a noir setting with almost like magic steampunkish,
like
techno
magic.
So you had flying airships and, you know, gears and cogs that, you know, move the machines of war and life, and
it was really Arcana punk, like, if that's a thing. Yeah, like it really fit that bill.
Arcana punk. If it's not a thing, we should make
totally make a thing. TM trademark right there. You got it. Nerdarchy. Bam. Yeah. Signed, sealed, and delivered. But like, whereas low fantasy, you know, like
could be straight up fiction, you know, historical fiction.
Right.
At that point.
Well, I mean, or just like little bits of magic.
Like Conan.
Yeah, definitely Conan. But like the whole thing of things get so much more complicated. Just like getting a message to someone is an adventure unto itself. Yeah. Whereas like high fantasy, it's just like one spell. My flap of paper turns into a bird and flies away to the to the person.
Well,
to go read
Tolkien was very low magic as well. I mean, even though it had wizards and and magic weapons and stuff. But if Gandalf, like in D&D, right? You're casting fireball, right? But in Tolkien, Gandalf is using pyrotechnics.
Right. Yeah.
Spells,
he's got I got some firecrackers over here. They fell off the back of a truck.
There's a reason why Gandalf had to carry a sword.
Yeah. That wizard thing, it was just kind of
so amazing things happened, and there were some crazy creatures in Lord of the Rings setting, but it was
wizard
really
in Tolkien means he knows stuff. That's what that means.
Yeah. So they had a low magic. They still had dragons. They still had tree people, but I
can fill out this W-2 form. Exceptional. I am a wizard, you say? Yeah. No, I love that. I think it was like the Whitest Kids You Know or whatever, a comedy group. They did that the whole thing about Gandalf having access to eagles the entire time, and how like the whole destroying of the ring could have been accomplished in an afternoon. They basically like kill Gandalf at the end of the sketch.
Well, another good one is there's a comic strip with Legolas in it where he just puts the ring around an arrow and shoots it into the volcano. From like outside of Mordor. But done. But I think we must digress and go back to the pros and cons of playing a fantasy RPG.
A little aside, there's a good rebuttal about the idea of using eagles the whole time, but
they were actually on their way to the eagles.
You can just go search it.
Circumvented.
Right. All right. So, what about you, Nate? What do you think is the biggest draw to fantasy?
Being able to pretty much do whatever you want. I mean, as long as you don't want to make some kind of giant mechanoid thing that shoots laser beams. I mean, because then you'd have to be a ridiculous wizard to be able to do that.
No, but just be what was it? The tinkerer or the what's the gadget guy?
The artificer.
Artificer. There you go.
Well, or get access to like the old arcane mechs that are somewhere.
So again, you can kind of do whatever you want in high fantasy because the magic is there. Is like, well, how does this even work? Magic.
I feel like it's easier to create adventures and stories in the fantasy world as a GM or DM because I feel like there's a much more linear flow to what you're doing, in the campaign world. Even if you go with a sandbox type of build, which, in case you guys don't know what that is, it's basically there's stuff all over the place, and then the players decide what they're going to do, and then you just run with it from there. Compared to with a more linear story, which some people call railroading, where basically they have one story and somehow they're going to do that story, but
whether they want to or not.
But the trick is making railroads look like sandboxes.
Right. That is the trick.
The sandbox is you have all these points of interest. But once they go to them, it becomes the railroad in the sense that it's all very linear and it's already kind of been plotted out.
Right.
It seems perfectly rational and logical to the characters. I mean, but yeah, the cool thing about fantasy is you can just about make any character premise in fantasy. You could make a fantastical Boba Fett.
Right.
Or Darth Vader, or or any of the various, Dirty Harry or something like that. You can make any kind of character skinned in a... I feel like that's the same in any genre. You can almost make just about any type of character.
Well, what really defines fantasy? Because this is where it gets a little tricky in the gray areas. Because you do have modern fantasy. Right. You have the dark urban fantasies like Jim Butcher's Dresden Files. We've recently run and played a Spelljammer campaign, which is more like a space opera.
Right. Space fantasy.
Which is based off of fantasy. So, in your minds, what makes it a fantasy?
Well, to me, fantasy means low-tech magic.
I would agree that it's gotta have some element of the fantastic, like some kind of, I don't care if it's mind powers, high tower spells, or some kind of thing that's beyond the norm. In that regard,
like the scope of power is not held by those without special abilities.
Yeah,
like the person who can cast that fireball, is not going to exist in a modern game unless it's modern fantasy. And it's a whole nother setting, a whole nother theme.
But yeah, I would say fantasy involves some kind of extraordinary powers. And extraordinary creatures.
And other places beyond our experience, in a way. Well, I mean, I guess you could get into that with horror, too, like Cthulhu type of stuff. But, the whole idea of having, like the realm of Fae or the planes or whatever. Like usually there's something like something coming from somewhere else going on too.
Well, I guess that's one of the fun things too. Is like when you get to the point where you start blending these different genres together. Because Ravenloft, what's that? That's horror fantasy,
Right.
Mm-hmm. What is Spelljammer? Well, really, it's fantasy and space opera. And then you have Shadowrun. What is Shadowrun? Well, that's fantasy mixed with, I don't know. I'm not sure what that would be called.
I mean, it's got some steampunk.
Biopunk.
Technopunk, really, yeah.
But is it closer to
cyberpunk?
Yeah,
there you
cyberpunk.
Go.
Yeah, because that's got some fantasy elements to it, but it's definitely got tech. I mean, the Shadowrun game I played, my dude pretty much stripped out of all his innards and replaced them all. I mean, it was down to like nothing with essence. It's ridiculous.
So again, it comes down. So what is fantasy? To me, fantasy says elves, dwarves, halflings, hobbits, whatever you want to call them.
Armor.
Definitely
armor.
I don't know if the armor is really required.
Well,
so
for non-modern games,
the non-human factor that you can choose
the non-human factor. The trope of halflings, gnomes, elves, dwarves.
I'll sum it down with 3 words: swords and sorcery.
Swords
and sorcery.
Yeah, swords and sorcery.
If you're playing a fantasy game, someone's casting spells, someone's drawing steel.
Well, that's
and
true.
I'm not
because
talking about a firearm.
Well, that's true because even in Shadowrun, you have street samurai and they use katanas. Oddly enough.
Yeah. Well, and pretty much every game that has katana, like it's pretty much the perfect weapon in everybody's stat blocks. Like because basically people are just have huge chubbies for katanas.
It is the awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for you, swords and sorcery. For you, it's all about
No, I think Ted summed it up. That's actually it.
Oh, okay.
It's swords and sorcery. And, which encompasses that whole, otherworldly races, which are dwarves and elves and your hobbitses. Hobbitses, man. You got to have hobbitses.
You got to have the hobbitses.
How about you, Ryan?
2 chicks at the same time. Fantasy.
All right, we're not talking about that.
Wrong fantasy.
Wrong fantasy.
So we've talked about the good. Now, let's move on to the ugly. What is, in your opinion, what's the bad of either playing or running a fantasy game?
I guess the lack of technology. How everything is so much more painstakingly time consuming and hard to do for the most part. And in your low to middle magic range of the fantasy, like if you want to go from here to there, it's going to take a long time.
Right.
You can't just get in a car and do the map thing that the Muppets do and get there.
Right. Or even if your character's like hankering for a set of full plate, well, that's like a year's worth of work there, and you're gonna have to wait around for that. Unless magical means, unless magical means are employed, you're gonna be waiting for a while for that thing to happen.
Now, I'll touch on running. Now, there are obviously various styles of running a fantasy game, but for the majority of games that we've run over our decades of being in this group, the someone not showing up at the table and the issues that can cause. In a modern game where you're city based,
it's easier to explain.
It's easier to explain. Okay, well Jim's at his job today.
Or his cell phone's off. You can't get hold of him.
Fred is he's got this errand he's got to run. He can't help today. Whereas in a linear game, if you don't stop in a town,
or the police mistook him for a terrorist and he's in custody for 48 hours or whatever.
Yeah.
That's a good one. I might have to remember that.
Because nothing bad happens to him in the end. They just got held up for a little bit.
Yeah.
But in a fantasy game where if you stop mid-adventure, you're on the road, and
then they just have to pop in and out.
Now all of a sudden, Fred's not here today. Well, what do I do with
You're in the middle of Mirkwood. Where the hell did he go?
Abducted by spiders.
Is that why?
And they only held him for 48 hours.
Is that why the Lord of the Rings party split multiple ways? Did Sam and Frodo's character
not show
up that day?
So
did the DM have to say, well, they just went off on their own?
They had their own adventure.
You guys got split up by Orca.
Or was it Steve running and it was, someone was playing... Boromir's character. Oh, sorry, he died.
I'm gonna just murder you. Yeah, in the face.
You were slain.
Yeah.
So you've got that issue, and in a fantasy game, it's very common. The last session I ran, a few of the players didn't make it there. I had to come up with some reason why they weren't there. So.
Yeah, so immersion. It's easy to break immersion
easily,
in a fantasy game because of real life circumstances.
Right. And real life circumstances, people being flaky.
Again, that comes down to a running style, if you will. So if I always ended in town, then that wouldn't be as big of a problem. But you can't always do that, or at least.
I like the feel of continuity and like the feeling of it is one overarching story. That's why I play tabletop RPGs and not like fucking MMOs because I like something that actually feels like an immersive story. And MMO, I'm never going to forget that I'm playing a video game, clicking buttons, having macro keys and like people like using like dude bro speak or whatever in the chat and lol or whatever. So.
Yeah, it's difficult to even get an immersion in that.
So continuity with your story is like one of the strengths and one of the drawbacks to tabletop RPGs with the fantasy genre. And really, it's been something at our table we've just had to get over it.
Sometimes you just gotta.
It's
just
like do you want to play or not play? So
yeah.
You get over it.
Right.
And sometimes you got to do some hand wavy bullshit.
Should we have any other things that we would put as a con or a negative?
Ryan mentioned it all.
Yeah, the sort of tracking inventory that happens, especially if it's a resource poor game.
You found 3 long swords that are decent. And you could probably sell them. Well, I guess I'll lug these.
Or one of them might be magic. You don't know.
One of them might be magic.
And that's the other thing too. Like anymore, I think we just kind of like let people know what a weapon does because it's like, as the GM, unless you're super sparse about giving out magic items, you don't want to think about tracking this thing that this character has and like doing the math of adding that +1 or
every time they do something.
Every time they take a roll with it.
In previous editions,
it used to be more common to get the +1 sword or whatever.
It was common to get the weapons and but it would cost the wizard spell slots to cast Identify. So it was like, oh, do you want to spend a week trying to detect magic and identifying all the loot that you just found?
Or do you want to cast Magic Missile?
Or do you want to just move on with the adventure? Now with it not actually having to take up a spot in 5th edition, you can ritual cast it. You can go through that pretty easily without it affecting the character's capabilities in combat.
And I think you can even too like arcana it.
Our rules were chucking that. Basically, if you spend an hour just examining an item and you're not even a wizard, you can just do it. You can learn its properties.
Yeah, it just makes it so much easier than having to like. But I mean, 3rd edition was like just filthy with magic items. Like you could trip over +1s and +2s. So that was just super annoying as a GM. Just like, yeah, it's a +2 longsword. I don't care. Here you go.
Okay. So here's one of the biggest cons and I talked about this a little bit in one of the recent articles I did.
Gen Con. It's a pretty big con.
It is a big con, but that's not it.
No.
One of the biggest problems is that fantasy's almost become so mundane and boring at this point because, there's so much. There's movies, there's books, there's comic books.
Oversaturation.
There's so much saturation that we take for granted when we're running a game. And so I mentioned this in my Goblin article, right? That a DM is more likely to go, you see 3 goblins, than go, 3 skulking humanoid forms lurch from the forest, with lightly green tinged skin, yellow burning eyes, and armed with rusty short swords and wearing leather armor. You don't get that anymore, and it's just like everyone just assumes everybody knows what a goblin is.
Right,
but
it's become mundane. The fantastical has become mundane at this point.
So I would say that's a really big con for playing in a fantasy RPG, especially if you've been doing it for a long time. That we take for granted some of the things that we used to in the beginning we'd always describe.
And like what I had brought up, that part of that is a running style, and linking onto what you're saying is when you've played a game for a long time, the monsters that you're using aren't a surprise. So you as a DM will either have to go look for that rare monster and make it have a reason to be there as an encounter for your players, or you're stuck using the same monsters over and over again that your players know. It's like, oh, it's a scaly, spindly little tiny creature that is popping out of a burrow. All right, well, it's going to be a kobold. There's no two ways about it.
But I think that's more of a psychological speed bump or crutch than anything, because it's a way of thinking, and once you assume it upon the players, then they're going to go with it as well. So it all just kind of feeds back on itself. Because there's definitely ways that you can make those mundane encounters more interesting. You can spruce them up a little bit. You can by using description, by not assuming everyone automatically knows what it is.
Right. But I mean, again, that comes down to a running choice versus.
I have to say, for certain campaigns, that would probably be the boringest campaign ever. Like we were talking about Ravenloft earlier. You see 3 zombies in a graveyard, and a ghost.
And
be like, I'm scared.
Oh, terrified.
Terrified.
Yeah.
That would be very boring. I mean, kobolds, okay, so kobolds. But if someone went through Ravenloft and just told me what monsters I was fighting, I would be really bummed.
Yeah, it's just why even bother?
It's a DMing style, but it goes over to everything. What it does is when you
it's
start
being not a very great DM. Here's the thing.
Well, no,
it's
I think
playing
it can
the game.
be used.
It's playing the game to have combat and not tell a story. Like that game is less
immersive.
That game is more tactical and less role playing and theater-esque.
Well, I mean, I think we all can make those mistakes that since we've been playing so long, especially playing so long as a group, that people can say, "Oh, everybody knows what this is." Like
shorthand,
yeah. Like shorthand, you see these things because we've
I
described these how many times.
I'm frequently guilty of it.
You dick.
Yeah. And I guess you could go through the description and cap it with a race, because maybe it is common. Like, I used goblins in one of my recent adventures, and it would be hard for me to not describe them as goblins and say they're goblins, because I had 2 goblins in the party.
Right. Yeah.
It's like
those
guys.
Yeah, it looks like those guys. Only angrier.
And now wearing clown makeup.
And less hopped up on drugs.
Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah, so describing that encounter can be difficult sometimes.
I feel like
making it fresh.
The best prescription for that is just play something else for a while. Like, seriously. Like, because if you've been playing fantasy for 5-10 years straight, just play something. Just do modern, do sci-fi, do a western.
And our group did just that. Yeah. When we switched from 4th edition to Mutants and Masterminds, and then we played superheroes. We played
superheroes. We did the Dresden game that I ran, which is essentially modern fantasy.
But it was still different. Like, I mean, and recently, even using the 5th edition, we ran the Spelljammer game, and it was just because I was like, you know what, I do need to mix it up. There was a time when I would never even think to not do anything with fantasy, and I hate it to enter any kind of modernist kind of mechanisms into my game. But then after doing it for so many years, it was just like, I need something more.
You know what was even kind of interesting and cool is just when you change, because different systems just have a different feel to them. When we did did we do Mutants and Mastermind, but they had a rule set for doing fantasy?
Yeah. But you don't,
I mean, okay, it was fantasy trope, but it was cool because every character felt so individual and different.
Well, that's because it was a classless system.
Yeah. I mean, so the idea of even changing up, I do just completely changing the genre, but changing the system, the feeling of the world, like, I don't know, like certain games I associate almost like certain illustration styles with, and that game that we had some sessions in, like, I imagine a totally different set of artists and illustrations of the world versus what you'd get with D&D products.
Well, we don't all think in art flip books, man.
Well, think of it also this way: you have a system and a rule set. It's like a language. So different languages have different meanings to them. Like there's certain words that just aren't exactly the same in different languages, and the whole kind of philosophy of how you think is different in that way. So I understand what you mean with using a different rule set and a system. Well, even if you play a fighter, he's just really different than a D&D fighter because of the rules that set up what he can do and what he is.
And of course, the actual setting helped. We had a DM who had never run for us before in his homebrew campaign setting, which had its own unique set and feel. So it allowed us to essentially
everything was brand new and shiny.
Yes, yeah. It was even though we had played using those rules, we hadn't played it in a fantasy setting. We'd done superhero games, and it was just like, all right. Whole new flip, whole new spin.
Yeah. Similarly, when we played Accelerated Fate, I was like, I don't even know what I'm doing. Because it just felt like so different and strange, but I had fun. I had a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And I feel like with Fate, you could almost do things that would have been like the Mutants and Masterminds, but I think it still would have felt different.
You know? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So that brings us back to what you said. Play something different. Well, play something different may not mean switching your genre. It could be as just switching your system, right?
Your system, playing with different groups of people. If you're lucky
enough,
that
option.
If you're lucky enough to be around multiple different groups of people that play RPGs, just because people have different play style.
Or you can do a few one shots on the one shot group.
Yeah,
on the internet from Facebook.
Yeah, could do that.
So I think we've pretty much covered fantasy.
I think so.
From our perspective. You guys in the comments, let us know your pros and your cons for playing or running a fantasy RPG. What do you guys like? What do you dislike? Maybe you hate fantasy altogether, or maybe you won't play anything but.
While you're doing that, click like, click share,
comment, subscribe, all those good things.
Yeah, you can check us out on a lot of places on the internet, like Reddit's Nerdarchy subreddit.
Nerdarchy, the subreddit, the Facebook, the website,
the flamethrower.
So pretty much you can find us. And with that, until next time, my friends,
stay nerdy.